Welcome to this presentation called The Pioneers of New Netherland and New Sweden. This lecture was delivered on Friday the 2nd of March 2018 at Roots Tech in Salt Lake City. Its purpose is to put the focus on the real cradle of the United States of America and its first Walloon, Dutch, Swedish and Finnish inhabitants in the general context of the European colonization of North America. As a prologue, it's important to bring back to mind that the first Europeans who colonized North America didn't settle in a void continent. The estimated population of the native inhabitants of the two American continents in 1500, before the Europeans came, was up to 50 million people called Amerindians. Out of them, about 500,000 lived on the east coast of North America. But 2 centuries later, in 1700, the number of natives on the east coast had gone down to about 100,000 people only. The reason of this drastic decline is multifarious. New epidemics introduced by the Europeans, massacres and enslavement of the natives, and the weathering of the native culture with alcohol and Christianization. The native nations living in the northeast of North America belong to only 2 language groups. First of all, the Algonquian nations, mostly peaceful and nomadic, that all the Europeans met first when they first settled in North America. You can see all those nations on a map on the right with their French names. They were scattered almost everywhere in the northeast. And then the Iroquoian nations, mostly warlike and sedentary. You can see them on a map on the right with their French names, controlling the central part of the northeast all around Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. The Europeans soon discovered the military and economical importance of the Iroquois nations in the northeast and sought their alliance. The French made friends with the Hurons, the Dutch with the Iroquois Confederacy of 5 nations, and the Swedes with the Minquas, called Aldust in French and Conestogas or Susquehannocks in English. The most famous Amerindian of the 17th century is a woman called Pocahontas. She was brought back to light by the Walt Disney Company in a cartoon film projected all over the world. She was an Algonquian of the Powhatan Native Nation, born by 1595 in Werowocomoco in Virginia. She was married in 1614 to an English pioneer called John Rolfe and was introduced in 1616 to King James I in London. You can see her portrait here, painted in 1616 in England before she died. She is the ancestor of First Lady Edith Bowling, the second wife of President Woodrow Wilson. The very first Europeans who settled for good in North America were the Spaniards. In 1565, they founded St. Augustine in Florida, the very first European lasting settlement on the continent. They did so in order to prevent French Huguenots from colonizing Florida in the vicinity of Spanish colonies in the Caribbean Sea. The French took a lesson then. It took them 40 years before they dared challenge the Spaniards again in North America, but this time they settled as far away as possible from the Caribbean Sea. In 1605, they founded Acadia in Port Royal, and in 1608 they founded Canada in Quebec City. The third European immigrants who settled in North America for good were the British. In 1607, they founded Virginia in Jamestown, where Pocahontas married John Rolfe in 1614. In 1620, the British founded New England in New Plymouth, and in 1634, they founded Maryland in St. Mary. And here comes now the very first European nation who settled in the Hudson Valley. In 1624, French-speaking Walloons under Dutch control founded New Netherland in New Amsterdam, which became later on New York City. And last but not least, the Swedes founded New Sweden at Fort Christina in 1638 in the Delaware Valley. In the following decades and centuries, the 5 European nations that had settled in North America from 1565 to 1638 struggled against one another to take control of the whole continent. The first conflict opposed the French and the Dutch in a violent commercial war in which each European nation tried to gain a monopoly of fur trade with the Amerindians. The Dutch won the war by selling rifles to their Iroquois allies, who could thus exterminate in 1649 the Hurons trading with the French. This compelled the French to explore the Canadian hinterland westward to find new native allies trading with them. Then, in 1655, the Dutch conquered New Sweden in order to strengthen their position against the British in North America. But that wasn't sufficient. In 1664, the British conquered both New Netherland and New Sweden, and then, in 1713, they conquered Acadia and deported its whole French population in 1755. And finally, in 1760, they conquered Canada. The French, though, took their revenge in 1783, when they forced the British to recognize in France the independence of the United States of America. The final step took place in 1819, when the Americans took Florida from the Spaniards. In the 17th century, the four European challengers of Spain in North America, namely France, the British Isles, the Netherlands, and Sweden, had different characteristics in Europe that explained the different ways they colonized North America. France was by far the most populated country in Europe. It had 20 million inhabitants, whereas the British Isles had a population of only 5 million people, the Netherlands 1.5 million, and Sweden 1.5 million too. The wealthiest and most progressive European country of the time was the Netherlands, with mercantile nobles, flourishing burgesses, and prosperous peasants living in a federate republic where minorities could enjoy some sort of religious tolerance in a Calvinistic environment. In all the other countries in Europe, intolerance was a fundamental policy aiming at submitting the whole population to a sovereign's will. In France, which was an absolute monarchy then, you had to be a Roman Catholic. In the British Isles, a parliamentary monarchy, you had to be an Anglican, and in Sweden, a senatorial monarchy, you had to be a Lutheran. In 1650, the number of European immigrants in the four American settlements founded by the French, the British, the Dutch, and the Swedes differed to a large extent according to the settlers' original homeland in Europe. In 1650, New France, composed of Acadia and Canada, sheltered only 1,800 settlers. The French peasants were self-sufficient then in France, and they didn't need to go to America to get a better life. Besides, the French king wanted to create an ideal France in America with no Protestants at all, and he sent therefore many Roman Catholic priests to both Acadia and Canada in order to convert the local Amerindians to Christianism. This ideal France in America had to be peaceful too. The French settlers refused then to sell weapons to their native allies. In 1650, New Britain, composed then of New England, Virginia, and Maryland, sheltered a population of up to 44,900 settlers. This high number was the consequence of the social and political situation in the British Isles in the mid-17th century. Most of the peasants then were destitute in Britain. They had been ruined by mercantile nobles and flourishing burgesses who dispossessed them massively of their lands in order to raise big herds of sheep for the growing wool industry in Britain. Unlike the French king, the British king allowed poor peasants and religious dissenters to emigrate in large numbers to North America. Still in 1650, New Netherland had a population of 3,600 settlers, coming first from Wallonia in Belgium and then from Flanders, Dutch provinces, and Germany. There was no national nor religious unity in this Dutch colony, the function of which was only to make business with the local natives for the benefit of the Netherlands. This is why the Dutch didn't hesitate at all to sell European weapons to their Iroquois allies to be used against the French and the Hurons. And last, New Sweden in 1650 had a population of only 170 settlers coming from both Sweden and Finland. This very low number is due to the fact that Swedish and Finnish peasants in the mid-17th century were self-sufficient and totally free with a specific political power in the national assemblies. The Swedish queen then could only send convicts and their families to North America. In brief, North America was colonized in various ways by the Europeans. It was a missionary territory for the French, a purgative territory for the British, a mercantile territory for the Dutch, and a penitentiary territory for the Swedes. As I said before, the Spaniards were the very first Europeans who settled for good in North America when they founded St. Augustine in Florida in 1565. Spain was then the most powerful European country of the time. The climax of its territorial expansion lasted from 1581 to 1640, when the Spanish kings reigned on three different European kingdoms. First of all on Aragon, which extended then to Roussillon, Sardinia, Sicily, and the south of Italy. Then on Castile, with all its colonies around the world, namely Florida, Cuba, Santo Domingo, Puerto Rico, Central and South America, and the Philippines. And last on Portugal too, with its own colonies around the globe, namely the Azores, Madeira, Cape Verde, Ghana, Angola, Mozambique, India, and Brazil. The French were the first Europeans who settled in North America after the Spaniards, far away from the Spanish colony of Florida. France, then, was not as big as it is now, as you may see on the map on the right. It extended only on the dark green area of the map. Acadia was founded in 1604 by Pierre du Gardemont, and Canada in 1608 by Samuel de Champlain during the reign of King Henry IV. The two founders were both born as Calvinists, but Samuel de Champlain had become a Roman Catholic before he settled in North America. Things changed in France in the reign of King Louis XIII. The French monarch fought against the Calvinists in his kingdom from 1620 to 1629. You can see the major battles on the map in Pau, Montauban, Montpellier, La Rochelle, and finally Alès. In 1627, the king banned Calvinism in New France, which had to be an ideal France in North America. And in 1629, finally, the French Calvinists surrendered in Alès. Many French Huguenots fled to the Netherlands during the conflict. Among them, two men called Georges Rappaille, who was born in 1596 in La Rochelle, and Jean Mounier, born about 1595 in Sand. Georges Rappaille died in America in 1662. He was born in 1596 in the French port of La Rochelle and married in 1624 in Amsterdam a young Walloon named Catherine Trigault. Just after the marriage, he settled with her in 1624 in New Netherland in North America. This French-born immigrant who settled in the Hudson Valley is one of the ancestors of Humphrey Bogart. Jean Mounier now, who died in America in 1670. He was born about 1595 in the French city of Saintes in the vicinity of La Rochelle. In 1626, he married in the Dutch city of Leiden a young Walloon named Rachel de Forest, and he settled in New Netherland in North America in 1637. This French-born immigrant who settled in the Hudson Valley is one of the ancestors of President Theodore Roosevelt. Unlike the French, the British founded in North America three different colonies where three different religions could be practiced. In 1607, they founded Virginia for Anglican conformists. In 1620, they founded New England for Puritan dissenters corresponding to English Calvinists. And in 1634, finally, they founded Maryland for Roman Catholic dissenters. The first two colonies were founded in the reign of King James VI of Scotland, who had become King James I of England in 1603. When he became King of England, King James left Scotland forever and settled in London, renouncing his native Presbyterian faith to become an Anglican. As the new head of the Church of England, he started to persecute the Calvinists in England, called Puritans, and those in Scotland, called the Presbyterians. His son Charles I allowed Roman Catholics to found an English colony in Maryland in 1634, but he fought later on against all the dissenters of his two kingdoms from 1639 to 1649, when he was finally defeated. Many British Calvinists fled to the Netherlands during the persecutions. Among them, English Puritans like John Tilley and John Howland, and Scottish Presbyterians like Sander Glen. John Tilley was an English Puritan born in 1571 in Henlow in the county of Bedfordshire. He fled in 1609 to the city of Leiden in the Netherlands and then sailed to America in 1620 on the Mayflower. He died a year later in New England. John Howland was an English Puritan too, who was born by 1592 in Fenstanton in the county of Cambridgeshire. He too fled in 1609 to the city of Leiden in the Netherlands and then sailed to America in 1620 on the Mayflower. He died in New England in 1673. The two men are both President Franklin Roosevelt's ancestors. Saint de Glennow was a Scottish Presbyterian born by 1605 in Dysart in the county of Fife. He fled to the Netherlands too, where he married a Scottish girl in 1638 in Amsterdam. He finally settled with her in New Netherland before 1645, where he died in 1685. He's one of the ancestors of Jacqueline Bouvier, the well-known wife of President John Kennedy and the Greek magnate Aristotle Onassis. New Netherland, where Saint de Glen settled, was not founded directly by the Dutch. In fact, the Dutch sent first to North America Walloons who had taken refuge in the Netherlands, like so many other refugees from France and the British Isles. The Walloons settled along the Hudson River in 1624, and Pierre Minuit, another Walloon, bought Manhattan Island from the natives in 1626. This colonization of the Hudson Valley by French-speaking Walloons sent to North America by the Dutch was a new episode in the commercial, political, and colonial history of the Netherlands. The Netherlands as a whole, comprising the Dutch provinces Belgium and Luxembourg, had been given to Spain in 1556. Many Walloon, Flemish, and Dutch inhabitants of the whole area had already been converted to Calvinism then. The Spaniards fought against those dissenters for 80 years, from 1568 to 1648. In 1581, the Dutch declared their independence from Spain, dividing thus the Netherlands in two parts, the Federate Netherlands in the north and the Spanish Netherlands in the south. In 1588, the Dutch started to conquer Portuguese colonies all around the world in order to build up their own colonial empire, challenging the Spanish one. New Netherland in North America was part of this new Dutch colonial empire. During the long conflict opposing Spain to the Netherlands, many Walloons and Flemings fled to the north to the Dutch provinces. Among them, Walloons like Jean de Lannoy, Jessé de Forest, Ghislain Vignier, Philippe du Trieux, and Jean Minuit, and Flemings like Pieter Winne, Fernandes van Sickelen, and Simon van Aersdalen. Jean de Lannoy was born in 1575 in the city of Tourcoing, which didn't belong to France then yet, but to the Spanish Netherlands. He fled to the north, where he was married in 1596 in the Dutch city of Leyden to a Walloon called Marie Mailleux. They had a son together named Philippe de Lannoy, born in Leyden in 1603. This son, Philippe de Lannoy, made friends with English Puritans in Leyden before they sailed in 1620 to North America on the Mayflower. A year later, in 1621, he sailed to New England too, where he married Esther Dewsbury in 1634. This Walloon-born immigrant who settled in New England is one of the ancestors of President Ulysses Grant and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Jessé de Forest was born about 1580 in the parish of Avennes-sur-Helpe, which didn't belong to France then yet, but to the Spanish Netherlands. He fled in 1598 to the city and principality of Sedan, which didn't belong to France yet either, and in 1614 he settled with his wife Marie Duclos in the Dutch city of Leyden. In 1624 he founded New Netherland in the Hudson Valley, North America, and died on the same year in Guyana while sailing home to the Netherlands in Europe. He's one of the ancestors of President Theodore Roosevelt. Ghislain Vignier was born by 1580 in the city of Valenciennes, which didn't belong to France then yet, but to the Spanish Netherlands. There he married Adrienne Cuvelier in 1608. By 1617 he fled with her to the Dutch city of Leyden, and in 1624 he settled in New Netherland in North America with other Walloon refugees led by Jessé de Forest. He died there in 1632. He's one of the ancestors of both Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt. Philippe du Trieux was born in 1586 in the city of Roubaix, which didn't belong to France then yet, but to the Spanish Netherlands. He fled to the Dutch provinces in the north, where he married first Jacqueline Noiret before 1616, and then Suzanne Duchesne in Amsterdam in 1621. In 1624, he settled in New Netherland in North America with other Walloon refugees led by Jessé de Forest. He died there in 1653. He's one of the ancestors of Theodore Roosevelt and Jacqueline Kennedy, née Bouvier. Pieter Winne was a Fleming born in 1609 in the city of Ghent in nowadays Belgium. He lived from 1643 to 1647 with his first wife on the Dutch island of Curaçao in the West Indies. Later on, in 1652, he settled in New Netherland in North America, where he married by 1655 a second wife named Tonnetje Adams. He's one of the ancestors of Theodore Roosevelt and Herman Melville. Simon van Aarstaden was born in 1628 in Nieuwkerke in nowadays Belgium. He fled with his parents to the Dutch city of Gouda and finally settled in 1656 in New Netherland in North America. Fernandus van Sickelen was born in 1640 in the city of Ghent in nowadays Belgium too. He fled first to the Dutch provinces and married later on in 1661 in New Netherland in North America a woman named Eva van Sallee. Those two men, born in Flanders, are both Humphrey Bogart's ancestors. The very first parish register in New Netherland was written in French as long as the whole population was composed of Walloons. The Dutch language was introduced in the register, though, when the Flemings and the Dutch started to predominate in the colony. In the end, the Dutch represented the majority of the settlers. The diversity of the population in New Netherland can be illustrated in a synoptic table showing the various origins of the settlers who married in New Amsterdam from 1639 to 1664. About 52% of the married settlers came from the Dutch provinces and about 16% from the Holy Empire. The Walloons and the Flemings, coming from Belgium, formed altogether less than 3% of the population, whereas 2.5% of it came from France, almost 7% from the British Isles, 4% from Scandinavia, almost 8% from British colonies in North America, and almost 7% from Africa. Here are a few examples of Dutch immigrants. Olof van Kortlandt was born by 1615 in Wijk bij Duurstede in the Netherlands. He married Anneken Logermans in 1642 in New Amsterdam and died in 1684. Jeremias van Rensselaer was born in 1632 in Amsterdam in the Netherlands and married Morretje van Kortlandt in 1662 in New Amsterdam. He died in 1674. The two men are Herman Melville's ancestors. Kozijn Gerritsen was born by 1608 in the Dutch provinces. He married there Vrouwtje Gerrits in 1631 and died in North America in 1686. Jan Pietersen Haring was born in 1633 in Hoorn in the Dutch province of Holland. In 1662, he married Grietje Kozijns in New Amsterdam and died in North America in 1683. The two men are ancestors of President Abraham Lincoln. Cornelis van Buren was born by 1612 in Buurmalsen in the Netherlands. He married Katelijntje Mortens in 1635 in the Dutch provinces before he settled in New Netherland. He died there in 1648. He's one of the ancestors of President Martin van Buren and Herman Melville. Martin van Buren was the very first non-British president of the United States of America who spoke English as a second language, his first language being Dutch. And then Matthäus van Deursen. He was born about 1631 in Haarlem in the Netherlands and married Helena Roberts by 1653. He died in North America in 1686. He's one of the ancestors of Martin van Buren and Franklin Roosevelt. Jan Peek was born about 1615 in an unknown place in the Netherlands. In 1650, he married in New Amsterdam in North America a Walloon girl named Marie Dutrieux. He died in New Netherland in 1664. He's one of the ancestors of Theodore Roosevelt and Jacqueline Kennedy, née Bouvier. Klaas van Rosenveld was born about 1626 in the Dutch province of Zeeland. By 1649, he married Jannetje Thomas in New Netherland, where he died in 1659. He's one of the ancestors of both Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt. And last, Teunis Bogaert, who was born by 1625 in Schoonrewoerd in the Netherlands. In 1654, he married in New Amsterdam in North America a Walloon widow named Sarah Rappai, married first to Hans Bergen. He's one of the ancestors of Humphrey Bogart. A few Scandinavians too settled in New Netherland as well as in Estonian. They were not Calvinists like the Walloons, the Flemings and the Dutch, but Lutherans. Hans Bergen was born by 1600 in the city of Bergen in Norway. He married in 1639 in New Amsterdam a Walloon girl named Sarah Rappai and died there in 1654. Lars Petersen was born by 1620 in Tønsberg in Norway too. He married in 1641 in New Amsterdam a German girl named Annette Peters and died there in 1664. Those two Norwegians are Humphrey Bogart's ancestors. And last, Morten Hoffmann, who was born by 1625 in Tallinn in Estonia, which belonged then to Sweden. He was married twice in New Amsterdam to Dutch women, first to Lisbeth Hermans in 1663 and then to Emerentje de Witt in 1664. He died in North America in 1712. He's one of the ancestors of Franklin Roosevelt. Apart from Calvinists and Lutherans, members of other religions were allowed in New Netherland. In 1654, a Jew from Amsterdam, named Jacob Barsimson in English, was sent to New Amsterdam by his Jewish community in Holland in order to welcome and assist some 23 Dutch Jews expelled from Brazil by the Portuguese. In 1657, he obtained freedom of worship for them in the Dutch New World. I didn't find anyone well known descending from those early Jews in North America. There was a former Muslim too in New Netherland. His name was Antoni van Salé, and he was born by 1607 in the city of Cartagena in Spain. His father was a Dutch pirate named Jan van Haarlem, who had gone over to Islam in the Algerian navy, and his mother was a Spanish Muslim in Cartagena. In 1630, Antoni van Salé left Amsterdam in the Netherlands and settled in New Amsterdam in North America. He died in New Netherland in 1676. He's one of the ancestors of President Warren Harding and Humphrey Bogart. In the vicinity of New Netherland, another colony was founded by the Swedes in 1638 in the Delaware Valley. This area was claimed then by both the Dutch and the British living in Maryland. The place had been chosen by a Walloon named Pierre Minuit, who had served the Dutch as the third governor of New Netherland from 1626 to 1632. In 1638, he became thus the first governor of New Sweden. This colonization of the Delaware Valley by the Swedes occurred when Sweden had become one of the major military powers in Europe. In 1600, the King of Sweden reigned on Sweden, Finland, and Estonia. 4 different nations lived then in his kingdom, namely the Swedes, the Finns, the Lapps, and the Estonians, and many Swedes lived on the coasts of Finland. New Sweden was founded in North America when the Swedes were waging war successfully in Europe from 1611 to 1648 on Denmark and Norway, Russia, Poland, and Austria. In 1630, they had already conquered the Russian province of Ingria and the north of Latvia, as well as a bridgehead in Pomerania. In 1614, the King of Sweden, Gustavus Adolphus, sealed a commercial pact with the Dutch in order to develop a powerful military industry in his kingdom. In 1619, the Dutch founded for him the port of Gothenburg on the west coast of Sweden, and then, from 1620 to 1640, they sent about 5,000 Walloon industrial workers recruited in Belgium by a Walloon-born merchant named Louis de Geer. Pierre Minuit founded New Sweden in North America in this general context of close collaboration between the Dutch and the Swedes in Europe when the two nations were fighting together, Spain and Austria. His parents, both born in the Walloon city of Tournai in Belgium, had taken refuge by 1581 in the German city of Wesel. Pierre Minuit was born in Wesel by 1589 and married there in 1613 a German girl named Gertrude Reitz from the city of Cleves in Germany. In 1624, he sailed to North America with other Walloons led by Jesse de Forest and settled with them in the Hudson Valley. In 1626, he bought the island of Manhattan from the Amerindians and became the third governor of New Netherland from 1626 to 1632. In 1638, he founded New Sweden at Fort Christina in the Delaware Valley and died in the West Indies on the same year while sailing back to Europe. The first 2 Swedish boats that anchored in the Delaware Valley in 1638 under the command of Pierre Minuit were called Kalmar Nyckel and Fågelgrip, which means the Key of Kalmar and the Feathered Griffin. Altogether, 12 convoys of immigrants were sent from Europe to New Sweden. You can see the names of the boats on the synoptic table here. The first two convoys only brought Swedish soldiers in the Delaware Valley. The third convoy brought Dutch families only from the Dutch city of Utrecht. The first Swedish and Finnish families arrived in New Sweden with the fourth convoy in 1641. The ninth convoy, on a boat called Kappan, sank near Puerto Rico, and the surviving passengers were taken as prisoners by the Spaniards. When the boat sank in 1649, the 30 Years' War was over in Europe, opposing until 1648 the French, the Dutch and the Swedes on the one hand, to the Spaniards and the Austrians on the other hand. The close collaboration between the three victorious nations, namely the French, the Dutch and the Swedes, started to fade, and the first conflicts appeared between them. In 1654, the 11th convoy of Swedish and Finnish immigrants was captured by the Dutch in New Amsterdam, and the 12th and last convoy arrived in North America after the Dutch had conquered New Sweden in 1655. The man behind the foundation of New Sweden in North America was Axel Oxenstierna, the Lord High Chancellor of Sweden from 1612 to 1654. He financed the first three convoys with both Dutch and Swedish investors, and the other ones with only Swedes. He couldn't send any boat to New Sweden, though, in 1644 and 1645, as all Swedish boats had been requisitioned to take part in a war opposing Sweden to Denmark from 1643 to 1645. No boat was sent to America either from 1650 to 1653, because Axel Oxenstierna had been put aside from power by Queen Christina, who didn't care much about New Sweden. In 1652, the First Anglo-Dutch naval war started. Queen Christina agreed then to send two boats to North America in 1654 in order to reinforce New Sweden, which was stuck between the Dutch in New Netherland and the British in Maryland. The first boat was seized by the Dutch in New Amsterdam, and the second boat arrived after the Dutch had conquered New Sweden in order to strengthen their own position in North America against the British. In 1655, the Swedish governor of New Sweden, Johan Prins, was replaced by the Dutch governor of New Netherland, Peter Stuyvesant. The Dutch governor ruled New Sweden until 1664. The Swedes did not react. The new king of Sweden, Charles X Gustavus, had started a fierce war in 1655 on Poland, Prussia, Russia, Austria and Denmark, which lasted until 1660. In 1664, the Second Anglo-Dutch Naval War started when the British conquered New Netherland and former New Sweden. In return, the Dutch conquered in 1667 British Suriname in South America. At the end of the war, the victorious Dutch refused to get back New Netherland as it was surrounded by strong British colonies and much less profitable than Suriname. Both New Netherland and New Sweden remained then in the hands of the British. In 1681, New Sweden was given to William Penn and rebaptized Pennsylvania. William Penn granted freedom of worship to the Swedish and Finnish Lutherans of his private colony, as well as to the many Quakers and Anabaptists who soon came in America from Germany and the British Isles. From 1696 to 1775, the Swedes and Finns in America were ruled by the Lutheran bishop of the Episcopal city of Skara in Sweden. Let me give you now a few examples of pioneers who settled in New Sweden in the 17th century. The first one is Anders Hansson. He was a Finland Swede born by 1618 in the Finnish port of Vasa on the Baltic Sea. In 1641, he settled in New Sweden, where he married Annika Dab by 1645 in New Gothenburg. In 1653, he signed a petition against the harsh Swedish governor, Johan Prins, and fled to Maryland. He died there in 1655. He's one of the ancestors of Jacqueline Kennedy, née Bouvier. The second Nordic pioneer was named Måns Andersson. He was born in Sweden at an unknown date and was exiled to New Sweden in 1640 with his first wife and his daughter Britta. By 1646, he married a second wife who was the daughter of a Swedish pioneer named Christopher Reppel. He too signed a petition in 1653 against the harsh Swedish governor of New Sweden, Johan Prins. In 1661, After the Dutch had conquered New Sweden, he settled in Maryland with all his family. He's one of the ancestors of both George Bush Sr. and George Bush Jr. And last, a third Nordic pioneer named Per Rambo. He was born in 1611 on the west coast of Sweden in the vicinity of a hill called Ramberget on Hisingen Island, near the future port of Gothenburg, founded by the Dutch in 1619. His name, Rambo, indicates that he was living near Ramberget, which means Raven Hill in English. In 1640, he was exiled to New Sweden, where he married Britta Matsdotter in 1647 at Fort Christina. In 1664, he moved to Pasjunk near the future city of Philadelphia and died there in 1698. In North America, Per Rambo lived during the Swedish governorship of Johan Prins, the Dutch governorship of Peter Stuyvesant, and the British governorship of William Penn. He had brought from Sweden some special apple seeds, introducing thus in New Sweden a local variety of apples, still called today Rambo apples. His name was adopted in 1972 by the Canadian novelist David Morrell when he created his well-known main character, John Rambo. One may say then that Per Rambo is John Rambo's fictitious ancestor. The growth of the European population in North America from 1610 to 1670 was quite significant, as one may see on the synoptic table here. In 1610, apart from the Spaniards in Florida, there were only 47 French settlers in New France and about 350 British colonists in Virginia. 60 years later, in 1670, the total European population had grown up to about 115,000 people, the great majority of whom lived in New England, Virginia, and Maryland. The French, though, were progressing more rapidly than the other European nations in North America. From 1640 to 1670, the number of French settlers in New France increased by 394%. In the 17th century, the Europeans started to bring African slaves to North America. The first ones were sold by Dutch merchants to British settlers in Virginia. The growth of the African population in North America from 1620 to 1670 is detailed in the synoptic table here. In 1620, there were only 20 African slaves in Virginia, but 50 years later, in 1670, their total number amounted to about 4,500. Most of them lived then in the southern British colonies of Virginia and Maryland and in New Netherland. From 1640 to 1670, the number of African slaves in British colonies increased by 347%. The average proportion of Africans in the whole colonial population in North America was almost 4% in 1660 and 1670. In New Netherland, up to about 12% of the local colonial population were Africans. The next highest proportion, up to 9%, was found in Maryland in the vicinity of New Netherland. Slave trade from Africa was introduced to North America by the Dutch, first of all in Virginia and then in New Netherland. The first African slaves arrived in New Amsterdam in 1626, 2 years only after the foundation of New Netherland along the Hudson River. The first 3 African women arrived in 1628. Their names show clearly that the first African slaves brought to North America had been taken by the Dutch from the Spaniards and the Portuguese. In 1644, the 10 slaves that had arrived in 1626 were freed with their families by the Dutch governor Willem Kieft because they were too old to work properly and too costly to sustain. In 1655, a regular slave market was opened in New Amsterdam, where up to 300 African slaves were sold that year. Here is an example of an American citizen descending from African slaves in New Netherland. His name was John de Grasse, born in 1825, who became the very first colored medical doctor in the United States of America. His father, George de Grasse, was born in Calcutta in Bengal and was the natural and adoptive son of the famous French admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse, who had defeated the British Navy at the naval battle of the Chesapeake on the 5th of September 1781. Thanks to this decisive French naval victory, the American nation became independent. John de Grasse's mother was the granddaughter of Jan van Sully, whom you can see at the bottom of the genealogical tree here. Jan van Sully, who was John de Grasse's maternal great-grandfather, descended from 3 Dutch settlers, namely Abraham van Sully, Dirk Wessels, and Jan de Vries, and from 3 African women called Fortuin, Anna Maria van Curaçao, and Hilary Criolla. As a conclusion, I would like to stress the point that the real cradle of the United States of America is not situated in former British colonies like New England, Virginia, Carolina, or Georgia. The famous Pilgrim Fathers, whom you can read much about in American history books, are not the real forerunners of the American nation. They only brought the English language to America, not the American civilization. In fact, the United States of America were born in both New Netherland and New Sweden. They adopted the Dutch melting pot of New Netherland. The American Declaration of Independence in 1776 was inspired by the Dutch Declaration signed in 1581. The name of the United States of America was inspired by the former name of the United Provinces of the Netherlands. The first capital was in Philadelphia in New Sweden, and the economic capital is still in former New Amsterdam, that is New York City. Besides, the population of New Netherland and New Sweden had no historical reason to be loyal to their British conquerors. The Americans are not at all the products of British culture. They owe much to the early mixture of French, Walloons, Flemings, Dutch, Germans, Norwegians, Swedes, Finns, Estonians, and Jews in New Netherland and New Sweden. This lecture comes now to an end. As an epilogue, you can see me on the left under the statue of North America outside of the Orsay Museum in Paris. This statue, representing an Amerindian, brings us back to the pre-Columbian era before the arrival of Europeans and Africans. Well, thank you very much for your attention. Merci bien, dank u wel, tack så mycket, and cheerio!